All right, so we finished our usual series, which is almost disappointing because it was a nice little rhythm we were getting into. But I'm sure you noticed we did that this morning instead of this evening, and that's because I thought it would be good for everyone to think about that question. But I hope it was a little bit more meaningful for those of you who've been coming on Sunday nights and following along with that study. This evening, I want for us to look at John chapter 1. John chapter 1. And I want us to look at what it takes to follow Jesus, what it takes for us to become disciples of Jesus. This is in the first chapter of the Gospel of John, so this is the beginning of the journey for the people we're going to be looking at. This is not going to tell us, every single thing that is involved in discipleship. But I want to highlight a few attitudes and recognitions that we have to cultivate, even as the foundation of our discipleship to Jesus. Now, we usually don't think of ourselves in that framework. I recognize that there are a number of ways to think about a number of things in the Christian faith. We can think about salvation from several different angles. We can think about our role as Christians from several different perspectives. And discipleship is probably not one that we spend a lot of time talking about. But ironically, it's the one that the Gospels spend the most time talking about. We tend to think of ourselves primarily through the term Christian, which only occurs very few times in all of Scripture. And disciple is the term that occurs much more frequently. Well, a disciple is not a unique concept to Christianity. It isn't even a unique concept to Judaism. It's an ancient concept where you have a teacher and you have his followers. It's something in between a follower and a student. You follow him around, they would do the things he did, and try to imitate him in any number of ways. If you were a disciple of Pythagoras, for example, you would subscribe to Pythagorean philosophy, and it meant you got to talk a lot about triangles, I suppose. I don't know what that might have involved. But being a disciple of Jesus is quite different. There aren't that many triangles, except when trying to think about the Trinity, I guess. But from the perspective of discipleship, I want us to ask what it takes to be initiated in. You don't just get to walk up to someone and decide to become a disciple. It's a privilege. It's an honor. And Jesus is a little bit unique in this respect because his call is very open. Jesus doesn't forbid anyone from coming after him, but he does have requirements as to what that might involve. There's no initiation ceremony that you see that involves dangerous activities. You don't see Jesus requiring people to pay some kind of fee or be of a certain social stratum. You don't see anything like that. So what do we see? Well, I want to start in verse 35, John chapter 1. And at this point in the chapter, we actually are thinking first about another man whose name is John. And he has his own set of disciples already. Verse 35 says, on the next day, so we're jumping into the middle of the story here, but on the next day, John again was standing with two of his disciples. These are men who follow him. And he looked at Jesus as he walked and said, behold, the Lamb of God. And the two disciples, remember these are disciples of John at this point, the two disciples heard John speak, then followed Jesus. And when Jesus turned and noticed them following, he said to them, What "What do you seek?" They said to him, "Rabbi," which translated means teacher, "Rabbi, where are you staying?" And he said to them, "Come, and you'll see." So they came and saw where he was staying, and they stayed with him that day. It was about the 10th hour. And John here, when he says 10th hour, is talking about 10 a.m. He's using Roman time. One of the two who heard John speak and followed him was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He first found his own brother Simon and said to him, "We have found the Messiah," which translated means Christ, which translated again means anointed one. And he brought him to Jesus. When Jesus looked at him, he said, "You are Simon the son of John. You shall be called Cephas," which is translated Peter. We've got a lot of translating going on here. On the next day, he desired to go into Galilee, and he found Philip. And Jesus said to him, "Follow me." Now, Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." And Nathanael said to him, "Can any good thing come out of Nazareth?" Philip said to him, "Come and see." Jesus saw Nathanael coming to him and said about him, "Behold, truly an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." Nathanael said to him, "From where do you know me?" Jesus answered and said to him, "Before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you." Nathanael answered him, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Jesus answered and said to him, "Because I said to you that I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe? You will see greater things than these." And he said to him, "Truly, truly, I say to you, you will see the heavens opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." This is a really fantastic section here. Something I want to bring out, just a little bit of context, is that John has his ministry in the region of Judea. So he's farther south. Jesus and all of these men, coincidentally, are all from the region of Galilee, in the north, near the Sea of Galilee. They're just from different cities. Some of them are from Bethsaida. Jesus is from the city of Nazareth. So he comes across them, first not actually trying to recruit disciples at all. Jesus, at least the way it reads, he's just walking along, and John signals to his disciples that this is the man he's been talking about. And we got a little about that in the other gospel accounts. But John points his attention to this man, and some of John's disciples leave John and go attach themselves to Jesus instead. And this is the first thing that following Jesus requires of us. Following Jesus requires us to listen to those who proclaim Jesus. That's the first thing they do, is they hear this message of proclamation, and they accept it. They accept this, the preaching of the gospel. That's in verses 35 and 36. That's the role that John serves. Little do they know that they themselves are going to become great preachers themselves at some point in time, and that they are going to be the ones who direct attention to Jesus, even though we see them starting to do that even in this passage. In verse 37, the two disciples heard him speak, and they followed Jesus. Now, these two disciples, who are disciples of John, and John points at Jesus, and they redirect themselves. Were they wrong in following John? No, they were exactly where they should be. John was this prophet who not only is calling people to repentance, but he is telling people about Jesus. Even before Jesus walks along, he's speaking about Jesus and telling of the one who comes after him, whose sandal he himself is not worthy to untie. He says that this is the man who must increase, while I must decrease. Well, that goes for his disciples too. Jesus' disciple count is going to go up, John's is going to go down. And they respond to this new information in a positive way. They weren't wrong when they were following John, but now that they have this new information, it was better for them to take a step up and start following Jesus instead. And that's what following Jesus, one of the things that following Jesus requires. It requires for us to always respond to more correct understandings. We may have a very simple faith when we are very young in the faith, and yet as we continue to grow spiritually, our understanding of various doctrines, our understanding of God, our understanding of ourselves becomes more complex and hopefully more correct, not less correct. And that should inspire change within us, as it does in them. You also see that in the book of Acts when Apollos is preaching exactly the things which he had been taught. Ironically, it was the things about John, the baptism of John. That's what he's teaching. And then Aquila and Priscilla come along, they correct that, just as they correct the disciples which he had taught, or Paul does in the next chapter. Verse 38, when Jesus turned and he noticed them following, he said, "What do you seek?" And they said to him, "Rabbi." They've already latched on to him as their teacher, which is a clarification. Rabbi means teacher. Now it means teacher, but it actually means slightly more than that. It means my teacher. It's not just a generic, the word teacher is Rab, but this is Rabbi, my teacher. They're deciding, they're claiming Jesus to be the one they're going to go to for answers. When they have questions, Jesus is the one whose answers they want. They don't want John's answers anymore. They don't want each other's answers. They don't want anyone else's answers. They only want Jesus to be the one to teach them. Being a disciple of Jesus means you must listen to Jesus' teachings over everyone else's. The words of men have nothing to say to us if we have a response from Jesus. They say, "Rabbi, where are you staying?" Now, if you go up to a person whom you have never in your life met, and you ask him, "Where are you staying?" I don't think most people would respond well to that. And I don't think most of us would want to do that. Go up to a perfect stranger, whether maybe it's someone that you respect very much, and maybe you're at some kind of conference or event, and you see someone that you really respect. You've heard all about them. You feel like you already know some things about this person already, and you see them from afar. I want to go meet them, and you go meet them. And it's, you shake their hand and you say hi, and they ask you your name and you say your name. And you have this kind of cordial but distant interaction, right? We've all done that. Okay, now, are you the kind of person who is then going to say, "Where are you staying? I'd like to hang out more. I'd like to follow you around for a while you're in town." That would make most people uncomfortable. And that would make me uncomfortable. I know that. Both to do that to someone and for someone to do that to me. That would be very awkward. But this is what they do. That's exactly what happens here. They come up to him and they just ask, "Where are you staying? We want to follow you." Because Following Jesus often means that we pursue, if we're going to truly be Jesus' disciples, we are those who pursue him to an extent that others are going to find uncomfortable. Other people are going to look at the way, the extent that we follow Jesus and say, that's too much. That's not normal. No one does that. You're being excessive. You're being obsessive. Why do you live this way? This is insane. The kinds of things that you do and the sacrifices you make. How many times have you heard someone say, I'm sure God won't mind just this once, or God doesn't care what you do in your free time? We've all heard such things. Well, a disciple of Jesus doesn't think that way. A disciple of Jesus says, I do care what my master says, and I will follow him. And it may make people feel uncomfortable, the extent to which I'm willing to go, and the things that I'm willing to do in order to spend time with my Lord, but that's what I am going to do anyway. Which really leads into the next part, verses 38 and 39. They ask this question, where are you staying? And look what Jesus says. He says, come and see. He doesn't actually give them an answer. And maybe this reminds me a little bit of Abraham. That God just says, come and see. I'm going to take you to a land. You don't know where I'm taking you, but I'm going to take you there. Come and see. And so they came, and they saw where he was staying, and they stayed with him that day. They trust Jesus completely, and they follow his process. Sometimes we want all of the answers right away. Jesus hasn't told them what kinds of things he wants them to do yet. He hasn't said what it's going to require of them. He hasn't given them any kind of mission yet. He's given them piece by piece. And it's going to be this long process of growth and development of their understanding. It's going to take quite a long time for them to really know who Jesus is and what he's all about. But they trust this process. And they are ready to follow, not just to lead. They aren't in this for a leadership opportunity. They aren't in this to be able to get ahead in life. They aren't in this so that they can someday have their own little disciples running around them. They are in this just to follow. They don't know what this is going to require. Now, we have our 2,000-year-later glasses on, and so we can read these names, and we can read about what happens to these men at the ends of their lives. And we can know the kind of sacrifice this is ultimately going to require. We can know that they're going to each, in their various ways, lay down their lives for their Lord. We're going to learn that this is going to consume the rest of their lives. That from this point on, they won't care about anything else. They're only ever going to care about following Jesus ever again. They aren't going to care about their jobs anymore. In a manner, they aren't really going to care about their families anymore. That isn't to say they don't love their families, but that's not what their life is about. From this point on, their life is about following Jesus and serving him. And you'll notice this sacrifice starts now in verse 39. They stayed with him that day. It was about the 10th hour. It's the middle of the day. This is late morning. They're already making a sacrifice of their valuable time. And this is some of the most valuable time in the day. By the time you get to the afternoon, they don't have air conditioning. It's just hot. Okay? So you do things in the morning and you sleep in the afternoon because it's too hot to do anything. They're using their valuable morning time to spend with Jesus. That's what's important to them. That's what this is about. Verse 40 through 42, we see what Andrew does. Andrew goes and he finds his brother Simon. And then in verse 45, we see that Philip goes and he finds his buddy Nathanael. And right off the bat, we see that following Jesus means fetching other people to follow Jesus. Now, they're not doing this because Jesus has given them the Great Commission. They're not doing this because Jesus has given them the Limited Commission. They feel this kind of biblical pressure on them that if they don't do this, then they're going to go to hell. They're doing this because they love those people. They're doing this because, look at what they say. Verse 41, we have found the Messiah. We found a great thing. And, well, I don't see what else I would do with this information but tell the people that are important to me because they need to know too. Verse 45, we have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. What else are you going to do with that information? You're not going to just keep it to yourself. If you're really a follower of Jesus and it's really meaningful to you, aren't you going to tell someone? That's what it meant to them. There are many different ways to think of evangelism. We talked about from a temple perspective of spreading the presence of God and multiplying the images of God, and that's all very true. But in an extremely basic sense, it's also just about sharing Jesus. He's the greatest person in their lives. They've just met him, and they already know that. And they say, if this is the greatest man we've ever met, then we want other people to know him too. When you have a friend who's very dear to you, and you have an opportunity to do so, you introduce that friend to your other friends because you want them to have the pleasure and the joy of that relationship as well. Okay, verse 42. You notice that Simon not only brings Andrew along, but he doesn't try to stake any claim of credit here. He brings, Andrew brings Simon along, and Andrew doesn't try to claim any credit. You will read about him one other time. That's it. You're never going to hear about him again. He isn't doing this to lift himself up. He's not following Jesus to get a name for himself because none of that ever happens. He's just doing this to follow Jesus. And he doesn't claim any credit. He doesn't deserve any credit. The credit goes to Jesus. And then you see, in verses 45 and 46, that Nathanael has this idea in his head already about what people from Nazareth are like. Now, Nathanael would probably know because he doesn't live all that far from Nazareth. None of them do. So they know what kind of reputation Nazareth has. And I don't know anything about Nazareth other than that Nathanael, who seems like he would know, doesn't have a very high opinion of this place. I don't know what kind of people lived in Nazareth. I don't know. Maybe they were all scumbugs and scallywags. I don't know. But Nathanael looks at this fact that this man is from the city of Nazareth, and he draws a conclusion. Well, in order for him to follow Jesus, he has to be willing to overcome that assumption. He already has an idea in his head about what Jesus might be like. He already has some assumptions in his mind about what people from a particular city might be like. And that's a very specific assumption for him to have. But following Jesus means that we let go of the assumptions we have. And instead of thinking like we think, We learn to think like Jesus thinks, because thinking like we think got us into the mess we're in. Thinking like we think is the whole reason why we want to become disciples and learn to think like someone else. And Nathanael's open to that. Was this the only prejudice he had? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. But it's one he is more than willing to let go of. Because Jesus dispels this notion from his mind as soon as he meets him. Now here's something subtle. I don't know if you noticed this. But in verse 39, when the two disciples of John come along, they follow Jesus. And they ask him, "Where are you staying?" Jesus says, "Come and you'll see." And then Philip, when he goes and gets Nathanael, and Nathanael has a question, Philip doesn't have an answer for him. And so, what does he do? He decides to just do what Jesus said. He says, "Come and see." Following Jesus means that we pick up and we learn to imitate the things that Jesus says and does. We might think we got a better idea, but Philip here didn't have a better idea, and he didn't think his idea would be any better, so he just does what Jesus did, and it works just fine. And if we do that, we live like Jesus and we talk like Jesus, we preach the gospel like Jesus, we answer questions like Jesus, maybe we'll get results like Jesus. Maybe that'll happen. It doesn't occur to us by ourselves. That's why we have someone to follow. Verses 47 and 48. Jesus saw Nathanael coming to him and said about him, "Truly an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no deceit." And then Nathanael is very perplexed by Jesus' comment, and he asks him, "Where do you know me from? I don't know you. I don't recognize you. How do you know me?" And Jesus said, "Before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you." Now you can wonder till the cows come home what that means or why that's so shocking to Nathanael. But the point is that it was something that Jesus couldn't have known like anyone else. It was something that another person who had said that same thing or another person who came along couldn't have said that same thing, because they couldn't have witnessed that. It's for that reason that Nathanael has this kind of reaction. I don't know why that's the case, but it is the case. And Jesus sets the stage right here for something stated explicitly in chapter 2, verse 24. If you look ahead, Jesus, on his part, not entrust himself to them, the people in Jerusalem, for he knew all men, and because he had no need that anyone bear witness concerning man, for he himself knew what was in man. Following Jesus requires that you know and you accept that he constantly sees you and that he perfectly knows you. We talked about that a little bit this morning. That's a hard thing to accept. It's not something we like to think about. But Jesus sets the tone early on with Nathanael. That's what this is going to be like. Do you really want to have, as your teacher, someone who always knows what you're thinking? No, I don't. I don't want, if I'm taking any kind of class, I don't want a teacher who knows what I'm thinking at any point, because then, whenever he knows I don't know the answer, he's going to call me on it. When he knows I'm not paying attention, when he knows I'm goofing off or a little bit bored, he'll call me on it. I don't want that at all. But that's what having Jesus as your master is like. You have someone who's teaching you, who knows when you're not paying attention. He knows when you don't care. He knows when you ignore the lessons you've been taught time after time after time. And yet, he will keep teaching you. But he still knows. And you have to be willing to accept that. In response, Nathanael makes a really interesting confession. This is the first confession of Jesus' divinity. Now, there are a number of places where individuals recognize Jesus as being more than just the Messiah. You see, in our heads, Messiah and Son of God and all those things sound pretty much the same because we just think of them as synonymous with Jesus. But those terms don't mean the same thing. There were lots of people who accepted Jesus as Messiah, as Christ, who accepted him as the coming king that had been prophesied by Isaiah and others, but mostly Isaiah. There are all these prophecies of this coming king who's going to sit on the throne of David, and lots of people accepted that. That isn't really what got Jesus killed. It was part of it. But Jesus went a step further, and Jesus claimed, although he rarely did so explicitly, he did sometimes, but rarely did so explicitly, he claimed to be the Son of God. And that was a very different claim. He claimed to be of divine descent, and therefore to be divine himself. And Nathanael recognizes this immediately. He's the first one to do so. This confession is, I think, really amazing, especially as Jesus says, that's all the evidence it took for you to believe? And you almost hear the Apostle John, as he's writing these things, chuckling to himself, I've got so many more signs to write about that are going to prove this. And that's all it took for Nathanael to believe. But it takes so much more for us to believe sometimes who Jesus is. Maybe not us, but it takes so much more evidence for most people to recognize who Jesus is than what seems to be a very small thing. Nathanael is ready to see all of Jesus, not just the parts he likes, not just the parts that are going to be popular to accept. It's plenty popular to accept that Jesus is a great teacher. It's plenty popular to accept that Jesus had a lot of really wise things to say. It's popular even to say that Jesus is king. But what does it mean when we start talking about the specific things that Jesus taught? The things Jesus taught about marriage, about loving your enemies, about eternal punishment. Those are things that are less popular to accept. Following Jesus means that we accept everything about him, everything he teaches, is, and not just the things that are popular or easy to accept. Verse 50. Verse 50. Jesus said, you will see greater things than these. Following Jesus requires that you prepare, or at least accept. I don't know how well you can prepare, but that you accept that you're going to go higher and further than you ever expected or could imagine. Jesus is going to do with you more than you could ever do with yourself. And that's not something that you can engineer. And that's actually going to require of you more than you set out to give to him, as they're going to find out later. Verse 51, and he said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, you will see the heavens open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Jesus has something in mind for his disciples. He has a plan. He knows what he has intended for to put them to use. He knows how he's going to use them and what things he wants for them to accomplish. None of us are going to attain what the apostles attained. None of us are going to be used in that way, okay? It was a very special kind of role. But yet, following Jesus means building my life around what God sees as my potential. It means not trying to hold myself back spiritually. Jesus has great things planned for each of us spiritually. It doesn't mean you're going to become rich. It doesn't mean any of those material things that we talk about when someone achieves greatness, or when we talk about the potential someone has and their skill or their talent. That's not what this is about. The potential that you have is to grow closer to the image of God than you ever could imagine for yourself. That you become more Christ-like than you could ever imagine for yourself. And that's what God has planned and what God has in store for you if you will truly follow Jesus. And finally, following Jesus means recognizing how much Jesus really is. I don't know if you noticed, but there are 5 different confessions about who Jesus is in this text. The first is from John the Baptist in verse 36. He refers to him as the Lamb of God. In verse 38, as well as in verse 49, the disciples call him Rabbi. In verse 41, they refer to him as the Messiah. In verse 45, Philip says that he is the fulfillment of the prophecies of Moses and the other prophets. And then, as I mentioned in verse 49, Nathanael confesses him as the Son of God. Jesus is our sacrifice. He is our teacher. He is our king. He is our prophet, and he is our God. He serves in so many different roles to us, and each of those roles has a corresponding role for us. He is our sacrifice, and we are the sinner. He is the teacher, we are the student. He is king, we are citizens. He is the prophet, and once again, we are the sinner. He is God, and we are his people. We are his images as well. Following after Jesus and becoming a disciple requires for us to give ourselves wholly to him, even in the ways that are difficult, even to an extent that we cannot fathom for ourselves. And it means that we're going to have to continue giving ourselves over to him. These are great sacrifices that occur here. We could also look at how the fishermen boys, I don't know how many of them were fishermen, but at least 4 of them, are willing to leave their families and leave their businesses in order to follow after Jesus. We could look at a number of other things that are sacrificed. But those sacrifices don't stop there. You see that sacrifice made, and yet after some period of time, there is a lapse. We watch them grow spiritually, and we watch them fall and return to their nets. And we watch them increase in faith once again and go on to proclaim the gospel for years and years. But again, we also see that at least Peter and some of the others stumble along the way in the book of Acts. Following Jesus doesn't mean that we're going to be perfect. It doesn't mean that we're always going to be successful. It does mean that Jesus is going to know when those things happen and that he's going to chastise us. And we're probably not going to like it because no one likes that. But the purpose is for our benefit. It is to teach us, to instruct us, to mold us into the image of God, just as he is. If you have any need, please come and we stand.